The summer has seen nations across the world battle wildfires and extreme temperatures. Now it has the dubious distinction of being the world's hottest summer on record. That's according to the latest European Union data. Just take a look at this graph that shows the soaring temperature over the past 35 years. In response, the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, says this shows that, quote, our climate is imploding faster than we can cope with, extreme weather events hitting every corner of the planet. Surging temperatures demand a surge in action, he said. Now, this comes just as the first ever African Climate Summit comes to a close, hosted by Kenya and the African Union. The event called for the establishment of a global carbon tax system, and in a joint declaration called out the world's richest nation, saying, Africa is not historically responsible for global warming, but bears the brunt of its effect, impacting lives, livelihoods, and economies. So joining me now to discuss all of this from Kenya is Damilola Ogunbiyi. She's the UN Special Representative for Sustainable Energy for All, and she's co-chair of UN Energy. So welcome to the program from Nairobi. I guess I have to ask you first, we've seen many talking shops. Year after year, we have pledges. We have the crisis explained, as the UN Secretary General did. What is your assessment of this summit? How did it end?
Well, thank you for having me on the show to start off with. I think the summit was a great success. For the first time, we had almost 19 heads of state in Africa coming together to explain the fact that they want to lead in climate action. I think this is one of the first times. We had over 60 ministers saying that we want to grow our economy in a green, sustainable way. So the narrative has changed from Africa just being a victim of climate change, of which it is, but Africa being the leader in climate action, in green growth, in green manufacturing, using our critical minerals for electric vehicles. So really leading the charge, and then asking for the global audience, which included the UN Secretary General and also the EU President, to come on this charge with Africa and have Africa really as a solution provider.
So, look, let me go through some of those points then, because yesterday at the summit, the president of the upcoming COP28, which will be in the UAE, said, we're not delivering the results that we need in the time that we need them. So how concerned are you by all the numbers we've been talking about? We can put up the Copernicus, EU graph again, showing this, soaring, an exponential rise, plus what we know this now to be the hottest summer on record.
I mean, I'm very concerned. The 1.5 degrees has to stay alive, and that's what we're pushing for. And that's what was key about this summit as well, that Africa also has a role to play. But Africa, as the least emitting continent, also recognizes it does have solutions to bring to the table, and it should also drive global ambition. But it needs financing to do this. And this financing has to be affordable and has to be accessible. And that was the whole call to action in terms of the new architecture and how we have to reform the DFIs and the MDBs to actually lead this charge. I think what is really important on continent is that this isn't only a climate issue, this is a development issue. And we know on continent that we have to develop in a green, sustainable way. So this is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to say that we do not want to develop like the global north. We do not want to develop on fossil fuels. We want to develop on clean energy. We want jobs for our young people with green jobs from the start. But we need the whole global architecture to support us in doing this.
So, you started in your first answer talking about the many African nations that did turn up. But I wonder what you feel about the very important and resource-rich African nations that didn't turn up. So these would be South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, as well as, forest-rich and mineral-rich, resource-rich Congo. Nigeria, oil-producing country, says they should be able to use these resources for economic growth and all that energy access. So if these important powerhouses, which they are in Africa, didn't show up, what does that say about Africa's commitment to be part of the solution, not just endlessly a victim, as you put it?
I mean, the heads of states might not have turned up, but the ministers were definitely in the room. And it's really important that even the Nigerias and the South Africa are looking at a proper energy transition plan. Nigeria does have an energy transition plan, and the former president has said 2060 to a point of net zero. And this will take a lot because this is the #1 country with an energy access issue. So one of the things that was recognized here is that, again, it's a development issue. Apart from transitioning, it's very important that there's still 600 million people on this continent that have no access to electricity at all, and over 900 million people that have no access to clean cooking. So it's important, while we talk about our development, our transition, to really leave no one behind.
Mm-hmm. And some of the solutions, those were also, and they are historically, very, very tricky to navigate. For instance, President Ruto of Kenya said it is time to have a global conversation about a carbon tax on polluters. The U.S. climate czar John Kerry said that President Biden has not yet embraced any particular carbon pricing mechanism, whereas the president of the European Commission says setting a price on carbon emissions is one of the most efficient and one of the most effective tools in our hands. So with those important constituents and stakeholders seemingly at odds, what do you see as the likelihood of a carbon tax, for instance?
I mean, I think it's really important that the nations that pollute do pay for it. And it's very, very paramount that you also need this financing to finance development and climate-friendly solutions. So I don't think that anybody should be let off to continue polluting. I think we all know we have a 1.5-degree target. We all know we have a net zero target. But if you continuously pollute, I think the G20 countries should be held to account. And we should see how transparently we can get this done to allow these funds to be needed, that's critically needed, in Africa, to be used for development and climate-friendly projects.
So, Western countries and others announced various investments, to Africa during this summit. But again, John Kerry acknowledged that, there's a huge gap, there's a huge problem because so many African countries are beset by debt. This is some of what he said.
If justice is to mean anything, it certainly has to mean that if there's going to be a transition, everybody has to be able to share in the benefits of that transition. Right now, it is clear that you can't talk about a just transition, when some people, there's no transition at all, or when some people, there is acute, unfair debt that swallows and drowns the choices that those countries have to make.
What did you think when you heard that? How important was that statement?
Well, we've all been at this for quite a long time about the debt crisis, and it's critical because already governments are strained. They're already spending a lot of money on adaptation and mitigation in their current budgets. Now that they're paying so much for debt servicing, they just don't have the headroom and the fiscal space to also pay for climate. And this is why President Ruto and the presidents that were here today were like, we have to do something about the debt crisis, and we really have to treat this as a crisis. If it's a crisis and leaving no one behind and connecting people to energy to live a dignified life is truly a crisis in the world. And you have to recognize access to energy has to be by 2030. We have to treat it, and the financing has to be affordable, has to be accessible, and we have to find a solution to the current debt crisis that a lot of these countries are suffering from.
Yeah, and as you say, this has been an issue that has plagued this whole continent for sure, for decades. So President Ruto said and acknowledged that $23 billion in commitments had been made at this summit. But, the continent has heard all this before. In 2009, as part of COP15, developed countries committed to mobilize $100 billion annually in climate finance by 2020. Have they even done that?
No, we have not achieved the 100 billion that we've been asking for. And we're really hoping that COP28 is the turning point. But what we thought this summit, which I think was exciting, was the number of bilateral agreements that were also sought after. And the UAE, as COP president, did put forward a pledge to install 15 gigawatts of clean energy into the continent by 2030. That's roughly an investment of about 4.5 billion. But I want to put it in context. Today, or the latest figures show in sub-Saharan Africa, and we only have an installed capacity of 81 gigawatts of energy. So you can imagine if 15 gigawatts of clean energy comes into the system, how it would transform the system and how it would let Africa be a forward-thinking voice. I mean, we've already seen leadership in this country here, Kenya, with having over 90% of its grid already being supplied by renewable energy. I think it's important that people should understand that they can learn from African countries as well, not just see Africa as a place that they have to teach.
So, you know, to that point, Africa, you know, comprises about 17% of the world's population and contributes only 4% of the global carbon emissions. Yet it is the most vulnerable to the effects. Where do you see the light? Apart from what we've just spoken about, the promises, and some of them have been unmet for years, where do you see the light for Africa on this issue?
So first, you know, in my lifetime, I never thought I would see African governments coming together and such a force and saying that they want to commit to climate ambition. But more importantly, they want to lead the world on climate ambition. So I think that we need to appreciate this moment that we have right now. The second part is really with the youth. The entrepreneurial spirit that's going on here, the different kind of innovations that people are coming up with for energy action, for power supply, for agro, for tech businesses, for climate-friendly solutions. That's just happening organically because of the environment that they're in without a lot of funding. You can imagine if we created pools of funding to really grow this innovation at scale, we would be able to solve our own issues. So that is the hope that I see from this summit. The youth have had a very big voice. The other hope that I see is just the penetration of renewable energy, really exciting technologies, green manufacturing. You know, here we have an electric vehicle bus manufacturing hub. I went to see some e-bikes hubs. You know, in Ghana, we're seeing it. In Nigeria, we're seeing it. So people are doing things organically and the private sector is driving it to actually go away from harmful fossil fuels because they know it's not sustainable for their environment or their economies.
Damilola Ogunbiyi, thank you so much indeed for joining us.